We're pleased to have you with us. This program is put on by the Research Program Subcommittee, which reports to the Science Committee of the AAN. And I am pleased to introduce Dr. Peter Todd, who is a member of the Research Program Subcommittee and from the University of Michigan. He's an associate professor and is a director of the U of M Ataxia Clinic, and then clinically serves patients at the University of Minnesota as well as the VA Medical Center in Ann Arbor. Dr. Todd, welcome and thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. I serve patients at the University of Michigan, but I am originally from Minnesota, so I'm still connected to that. So thank you all for joining us in the seminar today. We thought this would be a useful tool for those of you who are thinking about applying for the AAN fellowships or other grant fellowships as part of your future careers. I want to advance to the next slide. So I just want to briefly introduce the other members of the panel that we're going to walk through a series of questions with. So Erika Augustine is the Associate Chief Science Officer at the Kennedy Krieger Institute. And she does clinical research focused on advancing therapeutic development in pediatric neurologic disorders. She's also launched a series of different programs through the Child Neurologist Society, including the Minority Research Scholars Program, because that sort of is dedicated to fostering diversity in the next generation of clinician scientists. Erika also served on the research committee with me and has played a role in evaluating AAN fellowship applications in the past. We also have two AAN fellowship recipients, Hugo Aparicio and Sarah Getz. Hugo is an assistant professor of neurology at Boston University and is a clinician scientist studying stroke and vascular disease, vascular causes of dementia. He received an AAN clinical research fellowship in 2020. And he also has research supported by the Alzheimer's Association and the National Institute of Health. Sarah is an instructor in neuropsychology at the University of Miami and has a PhD in cognitive neuroscience. And she also got an AAN fellowship and a McKnight fellowship in 2020. So they can give you some firsthand advice and input on their recent experiences going through this process. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to spend a couple minutes talking over the AAN research program. And then there was a number of questions that were pre-submitted to the panel that we'll walk through with answers to kind of get over what we feel are the key elements to putting together a good research proposal. And then we're going to leave some time at the end, hopefully to allow for questions from the broader audience that are participating today. Next slide, please. So there's a number of different awards through the American Academy of Neurology, and these awards have been really helpful at launching research careers in clinical and translational research among neurologists and neuroscience affiliated faculty throughout the country. I got one of these awards back in 2008, and I've been actively involved in sort of aspects of the process and trying to get new members, new people to join and participate in getting these awards and launch their own careers ever since. There's a list of those awards at this AAN website, which is listed on the slide. And the specific requests for applications will come out in mid-June. With a timeline for applications actually later in October. Then we also simplified the process over recent years, allowing you to apply to a specific category and instead of having to choose a specific award, named award for your application. Next slide, please. So before we kind of get into the questions, I thought we would just outline a few key elements that I think are helpful for success in applications for grants. I've been both successful at getting grants, and I've reviewed a lot of grants, and I've also been successful at failing to get grants, which has taught me as much as the successes. So I think that the key elements to any successful application are a well-developed hypothesis, so a good idea of what you're really going to do, and a detailed statistical plan that will allow you to kind of address that through directed measures. Also, for these kind of career development awards, a strong mentorship is critical to launching a successful career. That mentorship can come both locally and from afar, but is really an element that's key to anybody starting out their career elements. A lot of times with these initiating awards, there's a tendency to make really broad plans and have a lot of difficulties with feasibility. So making sure that you have feasible primary outcomes that can actually be accomplished in the time zone, in the time frame that you're proposing is important. But we're also looking for things that are highly innovative and thought-provoking. And a well-designed training plan and well-written application are really critical to having an application that's going to be successful. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm going to just move on and begin our sort of series of questions for the applicants, or excuse me, not the applicants, for the participants. And so our first question is actually going to go to all of them. And so the question is, in your opinion, what is the most important element of a successful application and why? So go ahead. Why don't we start with Erika? She's first on my screen.
Good evening, everyone. You know, I think that the research question is really critical. It should be something that you're excited about. And I think if you can really find an area and a question that you're passionate about, it'll keep you up at night. You'll want to think about it all the time. You're going to want to meet the people in that area who can help refine and frame that question. You will get your mentors excited about what you're doing. And so I do think it comes back to that core question or set of questions that really help launch and shape a career. And I think when you're passionate about a topic, it really comes through in your application. And what you want is for your reviewers to be excited about what you do. So if you can have that initial passion and excitement, I think all of the rest can come and emerge from that.
Sarah?
I'm just nodding my head because I think Erika answered that question beautifully. It's something that you want to, spend your spare time on and, work on when the thoughts that you think of when you wake up in the morning. So I think that's a beautiful answer, and it's absolutely true. Whatever you're passionate about, I mean, perhaps your mentors may suggest something, but you look into and you research your own questions and what you think you'd be most interested in, and you pinpoint that question. We can talk more about how to form a hypothesis, but that's really where you start, from the top down.
Hugo?
I'm going to second what the previous panelists also said here. I would say, just from a practical standpoint, if your research question or your methods really don't work or have the impact that they should, that can be a major weakness in an application and really hard to address on resubmission. So, it's probably one of those things that can be a fatal flaw you want to address. You can always become a stronger candidate, get more mentors, get a better environment or resources, but you can't fix a poorly framed question.
Right. So I think it's pretty obvious from all the panelists. If you're going to dedicate your life to something, make it something you really care about, because that's really what you're launching here. You're launching a career. And I think if it's not an idea that's keeping you up when you're in the shower, washing your hair, making you think about it when you wake up in the morning, it's probably not the right idea. And you should keep trying to find what that next thing is. All right. So our next question is for Dr. Augustine. What are the current funding priorities for the AAN Research Award?
I think the AAN, they have just such a beautiful, clear vision statement. And I like to go back to that. And its vision is to be indispensable to its members. And that really drives everything that the AAN does in partnership with others. And that really is how I think about the funding priorities. The funding priorities are the people. And so it actually is the members, and it is the early career investigator. We know that there is so much work that we have to do as it relates to advancing care in neurological conditions across the whole spectrum of neurological disease and associated conditions. But we also know that early career is a really vulnerable time in being able to sustain or even initiate a research career. And so going back to the person, support the funding priority is to support the people who are going to push the field forward, the people who are going to create the new ideas that ideally have that return on investment many years down the road, leading to new treatments, new understanding of brain diseases, new understanding of neuroscience. And so the priority is the person. Now, what does that look like operationally? I think in terms of the logistics of it all, the kinds of funds that are available are largely career development awards or related kinds of awards, where again, the investment is in the applicant to have protected time and to have the opportunity to really dive into the science that they'd like to pursue. And so there are variations on that theme. And the variations that you see aren't really a difference in funding priority, but rather a way that the AAN, the American Brain Foundation, and its other foundation partners create a whole portfolio of funding opportunities that have the potential to support a diverse set of neuroscientists and clinician researchers who have a diverse set of interests as it relates to the science, as it relates to specific diseases. So broad set of opportunities, but the common theme is the idea of really supporting the person at that early career stage.
Great, thanks. So I forgot to mention earlier that if you have questions that you want to have answered, you can actually put them in the question and answer section, and that will allow us to address them later. Don't worry if you ask a question that we end up actually already addressing before we get to that stage, we'll just take those out. We want to make sure we capture those new ideas as they come through. So our next question for Dr. Aparicio is, can you share your thoughts on developing a research strategy?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I think it's important to first develop your research questions. You can put them on paper by trying to write out a set of specific aims. And before you go on to write the application, have your mentors and your colleagues read those specific aims to give you feedback. And really make this an iterative process where you are going to get unique perspectives, even from people outside of your lab or your research team, to tell you what they think about your research questions, your specific aims, your objectives. That gives you the ability to get better clarity about what you want to research, why it's important, and how feasible it is to do with the data that you have. And hand in hand with that, you've got to be very familiar with your own research methods, because you want to be able to show in your application that you're capable of answering those research questions using the methods and the data that you have. So that all comes together, but it takes like weeks or months to really start getting really comfortable with.
Great. So next question for Dr. Getz, Sarah. How to handle reviewers' concerns when you have an off-site mentor essential to your proposal. So this is something that comes up a lot for those of you that are not in exactly the same place as one of the mentors. They're going to play a role.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And so I do have my core team of mentors has been at the University of Miami. But what I've sort of developed is a team of outside mentors or advisors, so to speak, that are really national experts in the field in which I'm interested in and with whom I have previous relationships. So, I think you can establish your team of mentors within your internal university, and then always identify other people that will advise you outside of the mentors, assuming your mentors are okay with it. And for me, this is a team of younger investigators that are very successful at obtaining grants and publishing. So I think it's important to establish that balance. And, I think the best way to do it is formally address the internal people, if that's what's essential. And then you can thus far establish the other, collaborators and advisors.
Yeah. And I can speak from somebody who's reviewed these. I think it's important to make it clear that this is not just somebody you get a letter from. An external mentor really needs to be playing an active role in the process.
Exactly.
Next question is for Dr. Augustine. What are some pitfalls you often see in research grant proposals, and how do you recommend avoiding them?
I'd like to touch on a few things. I think there are some common errors or common issues, some of which, space constraints make hard to address. But I think the first one is to read the RFA, read the request for applications, read the instructions thoroughly, and keep reading them throughout the time as you're writing your application. It helps to make sure that you understand all the elements that are required for the application. It helps you understand often where the priorities are and whether or not whether your work actually is a good fit for those priorities. It helps you understand certain limits, whether that's even specifically the page limits of your application or limits as it relates to funds or eligibility. But it's more than just sort of that one time, I think this is a good fit. Continuing to revisit those instructions in detail throughout the writing process, right up to submission, can be really helpful. You don't want to have a circumstance where you've submitted an application and because of a simple error that something you missed in the instructions makes it so that your application doesn't get reviewed. And that does happen. So that's probably a key thing. And then even when it's reviewed, sometimes those instructions come back up when what's been submitted as the application isn't actually a fit for the grant mechanism. So that's a key one. I think another thing has started to come up already, and that's assuming knowledge, assuming that the person reviewing your grant knows what you know. And that can mean all kinds of things. So that could mean assuming that the reviewer is an expert in the research methods or in the disease area that is your focus. You might have a reviewer who has that complementary knowledge. You are also likely to have at least one reviewer who either doesn't know the disease or doesn't know the methods. And so you often will have a team of reviewers, each of whom brings a unique perspective, but it's unlikely to have one person who is as expert as you are in all of the things that you're writing about. And that's why your area and your applications are unique, because you're bringing together these things. Your reviewers won't have all of that. So to assume that they have the knowledge is a challenge. So you want to write to both the expert and the smart person who can learn quickly so that they can all then be on the same page when they're reviewing your application. But assuming knowledge goes to other things. Someone mentioned feasibility. What are the resources available to you? How do you make that happen? How are you going to actually make the research happen? What resources do you have at your disposal? And when it comes to external mentors, well, how do you make that real? How do you show the feasibility of that particular relationship? I probably have visitors. So there's also, you've got to make it all real and show how these things happen. And every aspect of the application is important. And I think recognizing that every aspect is important is also really, really key. And I think the last thing that I would say is that if you see flaws or your mentors see flaws in the application, your reviewers will probably see them too. And that's okay. It's okay to talk about them and sort of take that head on to really justify why you've made the decisions that you've made. But don't assume that not talking about them means that people won't see them or realize them.
That's all really good advice, and I thought you handled that entry into your room really well as well. So I would just
I'm going to address the room and
I mean, I would just really emphasize that the middle point she made about not writing this to the one other person who knows your science as well as you do. You want to find somebody who doesn't know much about your science, maybe somebody else in your department, a friend in a different department, and they should read it and they should be excited about it after the first page. If they're not, you haven't written it simple enough and you have too many acronyms and not enough pieces. So best grants are always super simple. All right. So I believe the next one is for Hugo. Regarding applications, should we specify if it is a reapplication and where? Are reapplications sent to the original reviewers?
Great. And so I'd like to answer that question in two parts. First, specifically for these AAN awards, there's not like a reapplication page or summary that you need to write for these particular mechanisms. And it's not necessarily, if you do resubmit like a revised application, it's not necessarily going to go to the original reviewers. So that's to answer the question directly. But at the same time, given you're probably going to submit something similar to what you had submitted the previous year, for example, it could very likely go to the same reviewers. So you want to be very attentive to any comment or feedback that you might get. And when you are revising an application, you certainly can, within an ANN application, write that, this is some feedback that was given to us, let's say, about your training plan. And here's how I have addressed it within the application itself. And then with attention to that, because it could be very important. And so and I'll tell you why. So first of all, if you get feedback about a grant submission that, and and it sounds like that feedback is addressable, that's really good news and really signals that you should reapply. If you can kind of fix these criticisms or address all of the criticisms that are given to you from the original reviewers, it can make your application much stronger. So that being said, if you don't fully address what previous reviewers have commented on and you resubmit, that ends up being a serious weakness and can make the likelihood of you getting funded much, much, much lower. So, you know, the main point is, if you have opportunities to reapply, you definitely should. And that's actually the experience you get in this career, is that it's a lot of reapplying, reapplications to different mechanisms, the same mechanisms. But eventually getting that feedback is really helpful and can make for a much stronger application in the future.
That's great. I agree completely. If you know, stick-to-itiveness is the #1 trait of successful scientists and successful clinician researchers. All right. Now, Sarah, how do you write a coursework for the, or how do you let me see. Oh, how do you write out the coursework for your research application? Last time I had a deficiency in this whole area when I submitted my application.
This is a really good question. So in my experience, what I did was consulted other people that have previously received this award. And I know that's not always an opportunity for everybody. If you have that opportunity, I would suggest it strongly. Secondly, obviously consult your mentor in what holes, so to speak, that they see in your training and what you might benefit from in terms of obtaining your specific aims, right? So if you propose neuroimaging, show that you're pursuing coursework in neuroimaging, or that you've published a paper in neuroimaging, or even you have pilot data in neuroimaging. If you are proposing a certain statistical method, show that you're seeking advanced coursework in statistics, or sorry, in advanced statistics. And look at programs within your institution. So make sure you look at, there are always, at least at the University of Miami, there are opportunities that are interdisciplinary that look, for example, we have the Clinical and Translational Science Institute, which collaborates across biostatistics, neuropsychology, neuroscience, and biology. So look for those coursework opportunities would be my suggestion.
You know, I think in my experience on the panel, I agree with what Sarah just said. I think the key element, though, is you just make sure you're proposing stuff that's actually going to be useful to you. So I think, you know, the whole goal of this is for you guys to launch your careers. And if you don't launch if you're just doing work to check boxes, Lord knows we've all done enough work in our careers to check boxes up to now. So it's really about trying to figure out what the next thing is to get you to where you want to be. All right. So the next question is for Erika. How do you prioritize essential elements in the application given limited space?
Well, it's all important. So it's what I'm saying, where each element is an important element. And sometimes I think about what are the messages that I want the person reading this to come away with, that I'm excited about this idea. Here's why it's a good idea and why it's needed. Here's why I'm the right person to do that work and that I have the resources to do this work. And here's what I'm going to learn from this study. Maybe, you know, those might be some of the ways that I would think about crafting the messages in an application. Then there are going to be some places where you have to make some choices, especially in a brief application. And sometimes that's around the methods. That can be a particularly challenging area of providing enough information and enough detail to show exactly what you want to do without necessarily going through each piece of each step of what the research methodology involves. And so you might also think about prioritizing what are the areas where there are going to be the most questions of how, from a feasibility standpoint, the work might get accomplished, or if there are multiple methods or multiple approaches to a particular technique, why I selected the one that I did, what's my justification there, if I think that's going to be sort of a source of debate. So you really do have to choose how you use the information or the space available to you, and then also make the space work for you. Meaning, especially for an early career award, if everything aligns and everything fits together, kind of around the same themes, the same ideas, it does help with writing, it helps with the communication. And when you have to sort of compromise on space a little bit, you have other ways that you can convey those ideas in different places. So it already should be that your career goals should make sense for the project that you want to pursue. And that should make sense in the context of the career development plan, the coursework that you plan to take, and the gaps in knowledge that you'll address. They really should all fit well together. And in doing so, ideally, that allows you to use your space wisely.
That's great. And as a reviewer, I'll just point out the one thing you don't want to use is don't get rid of the white space. Don't cram this into such a dense picture that somebody, remember, this is being read by tired people who just put their kids to bed after a long day in clinic, who are doing this out of the goodness of their heart. If you make it a hard grant to read, it's a lot harder to give it a good score. All right. Next for Hugo, what are the tips for making an application stand out, as most of the applicants use information from similar webinars?
Great, thank you. Yeah, I actually I have 3 tips I wanted to share, and the first one actually segues great from the previous question. I think the biggest tip I can give is that you should revise and rewrite the application so extensively that it is super easy to read, almost a joy to read, because a surprisingly large amount of applicants don't take the time to make their applications really crystal clear. That'll actually make your application stand out if it's easy to read, especially for people outside of your field. Second tip I would give is to use a conceptual diagram or figure that encapsulates your specific aims into one figure, like people are using with visual abstracts these days for their research papers. Similarly, your grant can have like a conceptual figure that shows all 3 or 4 or 2 specific aims and why it's important. And the third tip is to frame your research early on in the specific aims or in the introduction for why it's important, and you can cite like notices of interest from the AAN or from the research priorities from the NIH, for example, or from patient advocacy groups, saying that this is why this research is important and it's been discussed recently, and this is why I'm doing this research. Those would be my 3 tips.
All right, great. I like the bullet point approach. So now, Sarah, how do we get feedback on failed applications? I don't like the term failed applications from this question, by the way, but how do you deal with feedback on applications that didn't succeed?
Yeah. So I don't have experience with this. So I mentioned earlier that I might punt on it. But I would recommend, first of all, I guess if you have access to, let me know if this is correct, but writing back to whoever reviewed your grant and the mentors and just reworking it as much as you can.
And if I could add to that, ideally,
yeah, please do.
Ideally you get reviews. You don't always, but ideally you get written reviews from the people who reviewed your application, or a summary of the review, and to really take that information, comment by comment to evaluate it. I think after you work so hard on something, it's hard to get feedback on your applications, to be quite honest and frank. So sometimes I'll tell what my approach is when I'm unsuccessful with grants, because there will be unsuccessful grants. That's just part of the process, and persistence is key. But I'll take that information, I'll read through it, I'll try to, get a sense of, well, are these minor critiques, are these major critiques? And then I put it away because I'm probably aggravated. So I put it away, and then I put it away for a week or so, and then I come back to it. And then I'll break out the feedback into specific areas and try to think about can I group this is when I've had reviews from several reviewers, can I group the information into clumps or categories? Can I figure out what's easily addressable and what's not so addressable? And then I'll go and I'll talk about that with someone. I'll think about what my ideas are, about how I might respond. And then I might find a trusted colleague to say, what do you think about this? Does this make sense? Because having that outside input can always be helpful. But you know, that first read through and then going back to actually digest it to take action can be really beneficial. If you don't get feedback, ask. So if it's a foundation that says we don't give reviews, call them or email them. They might send you information and sometimes they don't, but you don't know if you don't ask.
That's great. Okay, so Hugo, how do we deal with how do you deal with publication inflation when competing with other applicants for grant awards?
Yeah. First, I just want to give a definition. So I think what they mean by publication inflation is that, you know, people who are applying alongside you might have more applications, and that might be because they're farther along in their stage. Maybe they're in a more prolific lab. It's hard to say. But, you know, it's an unfortunate dilemma that you need publications and experience to get grants and to get resources for research. But then you also need grants and resources to do research to produce high quality publications. So, you know, it's an unfortunate way that everything's set up. I would say that if you have few publications, just try to consider the career stage that you're at. You know, perhaps a career development award is not really the right mechanism you need to be applying for right now. You should be looking maybe for pilot funding, for institutional grants. I personally used an administrative supplement with my mentor's R01, and it was a boon as a bridge application to further funding. And I would say that don't let this deter you. Everybody has to start somewhere. You know, if you don't have a lot of publications, maybe that just means you need to take the time to get research skills, write more, focus for a little while, and then after a while you come back and then you can apply for what you wanted to in previous years. I will say that, you know, this is something you have control over, making yourself a more attractive candidate and being able to communicate your career path and show your accomplishments in a more effective manner.
And I will just say that, you know, as residents and early fellows, it's often, I think there are opportunities to be involved in projects that allow you to get on paper a little more quickly sometimes. And those are important to do. If you don't have much of a publication record, it can help. It establishes a pattern that you understand the process by which publication occurs. And that's critical to being a scientist. So, because it, you know, no paper gets in easy the first time. Well, no paper I ever write gets in easy the first time. But some of you might have a different experience. But I think in general, you really want to be, if you don't understand the process at that stage, it's kind of hard to deal with. So hopefully you'll get some of that. All right, the next question is for Erika. Would you recommend submitting the same research proposal to multiple funding bodies or submit a novel study to each?
I think that having a diverse portfolio as it relates to grant funding can be really important. Different kinds of grants are going to have different pay lines or different potential success rates. They may take different amounts of investment in developing the proposal, and it may be unclear, oh, exactly which one of these is quite the right fit for me and for my work. And so sometimes putting out multiple applications can be really helpful. That being said, thinking about the same research proposal going to multiple places, I'll go back to what I said about read the instructions, read the RFA. You know, each mechanism is different and just a slightly different way. They have their nuances, they have different priorities, and even I think there's sort of format, making sure that the grant is formatted appropriately for each particular potential funder. But then there are other elements of that you might evolve or change the work that you submit. You still are going to have your core research topic and your core ideas. But you want to make sure that they're shaped for the interest of the funder, meaning that the specific questions that you want to ask are right for that particular funder. And then you also want to think about, well, what does that look like in terms of the actual length of the award or the amount of funds available? So you can envision a scenario where one mechanism. Let's see, the Clinical and Translational Science Award institutes have internal funding mechanisms, KL2s. They're 2 years. There are K12s, which at least for child neurology and for rehab, they're 3 years. And then you have K23s and K08s, and they're 5 years. So you really can just think about that, 2, 3, and 5 years, different kinds of funding structures in terms of the amount of salary and protected time required, the amount of research funds available. The same application can't go all 3 places. You know, what is taking your K23 application and putting it into a 2 or 3 year timeline? Well, now you're overambitious. Taking your KL2 or your K12 and moving that to your K23, the scope is not broad enough. So you really want to think about the time you have, the funds you have, and what's important to the funder, as you might have a set of ideas that might have some overlapping pieces, but what are the set of ideas that are the best for that particular grant?
Yeah. Hey, yeah. A willingness to submit repeatedly is important, but if you just keep submitting the same bad grant everywhere simultaneously, that's not how you get funded. So, and part of submitting a grant is just what Erika said. You've got to listen to what they actually want. All right. Next is Sarah. What is your advice on writing specific project aims?
This is such an important question, and I can email everybody advice that I received from, so first of all, what I would recommend is if your institution offers coursework on grant writing, take it without a doubt. I did this like in the evenings while my husband and child were waiting outside of the building while, you know, I was in this course from 4 to 6 p.m. and it was absolutely invaluable. So within that course, I had a peer mentor with whom I shared, shared our ideas together, and we would overlook one another's specific aims projects. And we held ourselves not only accountable, but gave feedback. But overall, I mean, the structure you want to do for specific aims, and again, it's better if I just email this to you, is to start out with like the opening sentence. Like this is like the crucial thing that's so important about, this is how everybody is going to die, basically. And then the logical link to your research area, the key facts, and then what is not known. And then you go into each of your project aims. And the structure will be the same for each of your project aims. So I'm happy to share that if that's what people would like. The other thing I would say is to present your aims to as many different people as often as possible, but to also be cautious about the feedback that you get, because many people will have many different opinions. And the final thing just about writing in general, and is something I learned at Princeton. I did a dissertation boot camp is what they called it. So they structured 4 hours of time every morning where all we did was write. And that's the first thing that you do in the morning when your ideas are fresh and you can just get them out of your head. And I think having that discipline of just writing every morning is really important. And then the other things like the emails, everything else can come later in the day.
Great. All right. So this is a question for actually all the panelists. So can you each share an experience that has stayed with you regarding your grant application processes? Maybe we'll start with Hugo.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So this occurred really early on in my research path. I was presenting my research-specific aims at a junior investigator session at the International Stroke Conference, and the moderator, almost at the end, turned and asked me, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" So really, what he was trying to say was, how do you want to use this to launch your career? And grant funders really want to know that you're going to be really invested in the research, publish, and succeed because it's important to you. But then at the same time, the other moderator then said, yes, but you don't necessarily need to know exactly what you're going to be in 20, 30 years. These types of awards are really stepping stones, and they're going to give you the skills and experiences to eventually succeed in the research field and with the topics that you're most passionate about. So it was just interesting to hear the moderators kind of throw that back and forth against each other. So it's a combination of needing to really show you're invested in the topic and really passionate and interested, but also realizing that you don't know what you're going to be doing in the future, but just that the things that you learn along the way are going to be tools, are going to help you to be successful.
Erika?
I guess I'll reflect on collective experience that over time, I think I've grown to really value the opportunity to have outside feedback. And I've moved that earlier and earlier. I think when I started out, I wanted to have the whole grant written and ready to go. By then it's too late. So either you're close to the deadline and don't have time for people to give you substantial feedback, or if there's a whole need to really kind of rethink or overhaul the idea, you've already invested so much time in writing the application in its current form, you're creating more work for yourself. And so over the years, I've moved earlier and earlier and really spend a lot of my time on that specific aims page, getting that in good shape. And then as soon as I have an aims page that's reasonable, I start sharing that and have this iterative process of really refining the aims and then starting to work on the research methods and strategy in parallel. But I think getting more comfortable with sharing what might be an imperfect work is something that I think takes a little time to settle into, but is really, really valuable.
Exactly. Sarah?
Yeah, so I agree with the iterative process. That's essential to developing your specific aims. So they evolve over time and they don't evolve on their own. You must share them with your peer mentors, with your, other mentors, and you must work on them pretty much every single day. That's how they evolve, little by little, and that's really how they get to the point where you want them to be. And then after that, once the aims evolve, then you can write the other sections. But that first page is so essential. It really is, the specific aims.
Great, Sarah. And I'll just share my own apocryphal experience, which was that when I was a junior investigator, maybe my first year in, I was writing grants all over the place, more grants than I should have been writing at the time. And so I submitted a grant to like an internal grant for a relatively modest prize that I wrote quickly. And I had pulled figures from a different grant. And of course I had not changed the numbers quite right. So I had figure 2, 3, and 4 were actually figure 1, 2, and 3. And one of the reviewers simply said, if you can't take the time to write the grant appropriately and number your figures correctly, you can't really expect me to take the time to read and review your grant. It was appropriately harsh. I had rushed this, and then I asked this person to give hours of their life to read over this and give me feedback on what I wanted to do. So I now make sure that I spend a lot of time, but those little errors, those little mistakes you make, boy, they piss reviewers off, and it's almost no way to get back once you've pissed them off. So double check the little things. Make sure you spell check. Make sure you do those little things to make the application smooth. Nobody wants sloppy. If they see sloppy in an application, they're going to assume it's going to be sloppy when it comes out as a science. All right. So we've now moved on to the open question part here. And let's see if we have any questions in the question answer session. I see one. So I'll just ask this and maybe one of the panelists can answer it. Often we chase multiple funding mechanisms at one time. Please discuss best practices for discussing in an application how to handle if you receive multiple funding sources at once, i.e. what you'll do if you get the same thing, if you get awarded for the same basic application in multiple places.
I can start. You may not need to discuss it in the application itself. It is something to address if you have similar or overlapping scientific work that gets funded simultaneously across different mechanisms. Sometimes in your biosketch and a pending support or outstanding applications, you may want to make clear if there's another application, if there's no scientific overlap, if the title is similar, or if the content looks similar but is actually distinct. It's helpful to make that clear. If they are overlapping and you again are submitting a biosketch, then that might be an area where you want to make clear what you would do if funded by both. But most of the time, you don't necessarily need to address it directly within the application. If you are successful, though, then you'll want to think about which award to accept. Sometimes there's a choice that needs to be made. Sometimes you have the opportunity to revise aims, to pivot to another aspect of the research that you're interested in, and then to be able to keep actually both awards. But that latter part is really up to the funders and your ability to make good justification for why that should be, since that would be different than what got reviewed. And if you have similar awards, sometimes it's helpful to think about what are the non-monetary aspects that might be involved. Is there a program? Are there mentoring opportunities? Is there, what are any other elements that are not financial that go along with those awards as well as you weigh the pros and cons of each? It's a good problem to have.
It is. I would also just remind you that sometimes you're going to be on the other end. So if you get 2 awards for the same work, and you're like, how can I possibly spin this so that I can manage to keep them both for me, right? You've kind of missed the point, because there's not that many of these to go around. And quite frankly, there's not that many of us in the room applying for these kinds of things. So you are holding one of your colleagues back by not just sort of saying, I need one of these to do the project I proposed. The other one is appropriate for somebody else, and I'm going to choose among them, but it's okay to walk away. And that pay it forward kind of attitude, I think, will in the long run help us all. It is a team event. There's really not that many of you out there that want to be neurologists and researchers doing neurology research, seeing patients and doing research. There's just not that many of us. So we got to stick together. All right. Let's see. I have a couple other questions. What are your suggestions to developing grants on studying social disparities research, when much of early career work can only evaluate disparities and not necessarily eliminate them or address them, the latter being a frequent feedback? I'm loving it, Erika. This is great.
This is the reality. This is the work from home reality. So I'll have it on display here. You make it work.
Exactly. Why don't we start with Sarah? Maybe you could answer that question, or Hugo. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So this is an interesting question, particularly during these pandemic times. And others can pitch in as well. My approach has been to use, so the question is about online, and I don't know what your research question is, but I think that using mechanisms online, like, for example, Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey or Mechanical Turk are all useful ways to recruit people studying social disparities. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you have other specific questions on how to address it. For me, that would be the way I would address it. I don't know if you guys have other ideas, but it's a difficult question in these times. And so it's not like you can go out in the community and specifically recruit certain cohorts. Maybe you can, and you feel like it's comfortable, but
well, yeah, maybe Hugo or Erika, do you guys have specific thoughts on this? Because this is often a big problem in clinical research, where you're talking about applying for an award that's going to help you for a couple of years, but addressing the underlying causes is obviously a career's worth of work. So how do you get at that?
I guess I can speak up a little bit about this. I think that I think that you can always, part of this is you do often get feedback about how is your research going to translate, or how is it going to affect the communities that you're trying to do research in. And it is definitely true that, you know, there's already so much research trying to define disparities. There needs to be more research to address disparities. And so I just think, as with any early career research, you need to maybe think about keeping it small and starting some initiative that will complement your larger research aims. And so, you know, that can take, and I really like Sarah's recommendations about using some qualitative research. There's also, you know, there's fields of science developing in community-based participatory research, in qualitative methods that, you know, if you're interested in that, you can use that to strengthen your application.
Yeah, those are good ideas.
I think this question really is about a lot more than the specific question of social disparities and intervention. It applies to almost everyone's work. You have to start somewhere. And I think, going back to what Peter mentioned, that sometimes this is a common challenge in clinical research, the descriptive elements. You know, we're often looking for hypothesis tests and hypothesis-driven work. And there are some times where you need to actually describe before you can do what's next. And so I think that's the sort of scenario here. But whether the work is descriptive or hypothesis-driven, you always want to be addressing a gap. And, you know, for some, that's going to be a key translational gap. For some, that's going to be a specific methodologic gap. But in the case of this specific question, you can't get to the interventions if you don't know what the problem is. And so it's a critical barrier to being able to intervene, to not know exactly what the nature of the issue is. So going back to the way Sarah was talking about constructing a specific aims page, what's known, what's not known, where do we need to be, what's the gap between the unknown and the next step, really constructing your questions and your research around those critical gaps is key. And sometimes, again, that's descriptive. If you study a rare disease and your career goal is to develop novel therapies, well, you need to actually understand, you know, you need to develop biomarkers, you need to understand natural history, you need to have outcomes assessments. It's the same kind of issue. It's work that can be challenging to get funded. But I think really think about how the questions and how the work fit into a career's worth or a long-term scope of questions and goals.
Great. I think that's great help. So just to kind of finish up, is there any last words of advice or things that you'd like to offer to the audience? Hugo, Sarah, and Erika?
Go ahead, Erika.
Write and rewrite again, and submit and resubmit and submit again.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, you took the words out of my mouth. Yeah, just don't give up. Like we keep saying the same thing. It's an iterative process. So every day you come back, you look at it every morning when you're fresh, and you look at it again, and you look at it again, and you have trusted mentors and trusted peers review your aims and challenge you on those aims and how are they going to work. And then again, reverting back to the question about training, make sure your training aligns with the aims that you propose.
You go.
Yeah, it's all the same advice, I think. I have two sports analogies. One is it's a marathon, not a sprint. And over the years, if you're dedicated, you'll get there. And then the other sports analogy is shots on goal. Shots on goal.
And I'll just add one last thing, which is have fun. Have fun during this process. You know, we've all chosen to go down this road, which was maybe not the most profitable choice from a monetary perspective, but in the end, we're trying to make a difference in lives, and we're trying to enjoy the process of doing science with other people that are part of this process. So enjoy it. Enjoy it when you go to meetings and interact with people at the AAN. Enjoy it when you get to participate in science where you're kind of making an impact. All right, so we're going to go back and just have a couple of last little slides here to kind of share with you. So this is sort of a set of grant writing resources, which we're also going to be linked to from the AAN website. But I think these are all will be very helpful in providing information to you guys and getting some information about how to kind of put a grant together across a variety of opportunities. There's often settings at your own institution as well. If you look up help with grant writing, many institutions have built-in help at the institutions at which you're currently located. All right. And so with that, I just want to say thank you to everybody, to all of our panelists who did a great job today providing us information, and to all of you in the audience who were great about asking questions and participating.